Hello and hi. Tonight you can hear 5 true haunting hiking alone encounters on Appalachian forest trails horror stories. Before this, like and subscribe the video or turn on notification. Now turn off all the lights. Let's begin. Story 15. Footsteps that kept my pace. I chose that trail because it was marked in faint ink on an old Forest Service map. The kind you only find folded into guidebooks that haven't been updated in years. It wasn't one of the popular Appalachian routes with blazes freshly painted and trail registers full of names. It branched off a main path and disappeared into a stretch of forest most people passed by without a second glance. That was exactly what I wanted. I'd been craving quiet in a way that felt almost physical, like noise had been pressing against my skull for months, and I needed somewhere it couldn't reach me. I parked at a small gravel pool, off just after sunrise. The air was cool and damp, carrying that earthy smell of wet leaves and soil that only the mountains seemed to get right. Fog clung low between the trees, thin enough to glow pale gold where the sun filtered through. I checked my pack, water, snacks, a map I didn't fully trust, a small first aid kit, and locked the car. There was no cell signal. I knew that going in, and at the time it felt like part of the appeal. The trailhead wasn't much more than a break in the undergrowth. No sign, no kiosk, just a narrow path pressed into the leaf litter, like something had been walking it often enough to keep it open. The forest swallowed sound almost immediately. Within a few steps, the distant hum of the road vanished, replaced by birdsong and the soft crunch of my boots. For the first hour or so, everything felt right. The trail wound gently downhill, then climbed again, weaving through stands of oak and pine. Sunlight flickered across the ground, and the forest felt old but not unfriendly. I passed a fallen tree draped in moss, a shallow creek trickling over stones, signs of deer in the mud. It was the kind of hike that makes you breathe deeper without realizing it. I noticed the silence first when it broke. It was subtle, just a faint sound behind me, like a foot brushing leaves. I slowed, listening. The sound stopped. I waited a moment, then took another step. Crunch. A second crunch followed, perfectly spaced after mine. I smiled to myself, shaking my head. Another hiker, I assumed. Probably someone like me, enjoying the quiet and keeping their distance. The trail wasn't wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side comfortably, so I figured they were hanging back until a wider stretch. I kept walking. The footsteps stayed. They weren't loud. They didn't rush. Just a steady, even rhythm that matched mine exactly. Step for step. When I slowed, they slowed. When I stepped over a root, I heard the faint crunch of leaves as something behind me did the same. I stopped and turned. The trail behind me was empty. The path curved gently, disappearing into trees only 20 or 30 feet back. No movement, no sound, just leaves and branches swaying faintly in a breeze I couldn't feel where I stood. Morning. I called out, feeling faintly foolish. My voice echoed back, thin and hollow, then faded. I waited. Nothing happened. I told myself the forest plays tricks on you. Sound carries strangely among trees. Animals move in ways that can sound surprisingly human when you're not used to it. I turned back around and continued on, my pace a little quicker than before. The footsteps returned immediately. That was when the unease began to settle in, slow and cold. There was no delay this time, no gradual reappearance. As soon as my boot hit the ground, the answering step followed. It was too precise to ignore, too intentional. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was messing with me, deliberately matching my pace as a joke. The thought annoyed me more than it scared me at first. I don't like being toyed with, especially when I'm alone. The trail narrowed as it climbed, the trees growing closer together. Ferns brushed my legs. The light dimmed, filtered through thicker canopy. I could no longer see far ahead or behind, just a tunnel of green and brown pressing in from all sides. I slowed again, then stepped off to the side of the trail, standing still among the ferns. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. A cough, a shuffle, breathing. But there was nothing. The forest felt suspended, like it was waiting with me. Seconds passed. Then a minute. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough I was sure it would give me away if someone really was there. Finally, I stepped back onto the trail. Crunch, crunch. The sound came from directly behind me again, perfectly timed. My skin prickled. There was no denying it now. Whatever was making that sound was aware of me in a way animals aren't. It was responding. Okay. I said louder this time, stopping and turning fully around. "You can pass me if you want." The words sounded wrong in my mouth, swallowed by the trees almost as soon as I spoke them. No answer came. No one stepped into view. The trail remained empty. I felt foolish again, but now it was tinged with something sharper. Fear doesn't always announce itself all at once. Sometimes it seeps in through cracks you didn't know were there. I checked my watch. I'd been hiking longer than I realized. The trail had grown steeper, more uneven. Fallen branches lay across it, and in places it was hard to tell where the path ended and the forest floor began. I didn't remember the map showing it getting this rough so quickly. I considered turning back. The thought brought an unexpected wave of relief. I could head back the way I came, reach the car, laugh this off as nerves. The idea of retracing my steps felt safer than pushing deeper into unfamiliar ground. I turned around. The forest behind me looked different. Not drastically, no sudden walls of trees or blocked path, but subtly enough that it made my stomach twist. The trail was still there, but it seemed narrower, more overgrown than I remembered. The light was dimmer, the air cooler. The curve in the path didn't line up quite right with what I recalled. I stood there disoriented, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard the footsteps again. They weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me, just beyond the bend in the trail. Slow. Even. Waiting, I backed up instinctively, nearly tripping over a root. My heart hammered, panic rising fast now. I spun around again, facing the direction I'd originally been heading. The footsteps moved with me, always just out of sight, always matching me. I started walking faster, then faster still, no longer caring how much noise I made. Leaves tore under my boots. Branches snapped. My breathing grew ragged. The footsteps kept pace without effort, calm and steady in contrast to my growing desperation. I tried to listen for differences. Two sets of steps should sound different, even if someone is trying to match you. There should be variation in weight, but there wasn't. It sounded like an echo that shouldn't exist. The forest grew denser the farther I went. The trail twisted and dipped, then climbed sharply. My legs burned. Sweat chilled on my back. I didn't remember this hike being so long or so difficult. At some point, the birds stopped singing. The silence that replaced them felt heavy, unnatural. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and unmoving. The only sounds were my breathing and the relentless footsteps, always there, always patient. I finally broke. I stopped in the middle of the trail and turned, spinning so fast I nearly lost my balance. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The forest swallowed my words, then gave them back to me. "Who are you?" My own voice echoed, delayed and slightly off, as if spoken from a distance. A chill ran through me so intense it made my teeth chatter. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe whatever this was had backed off. Maybe confronting it had broken whatever strange game it was playing. Then I heard the steps again, but not on the trail. They moved off to the side, into the undergrowth, crunching through leaves and snapping branches in a direction no person could reasonably walk without slowing or stumbling. The sound faded deeper into the forest, moving with impossible ease over uneven ground. I stood there shaking, tears stinging my eyes, trying to process what had just happened. The echo of my own voice still rang in my ears, wrong and hollow. I didn't wait to see if the footsteps would return. I turned and bolted downhill, crashing through brush and brambles, abandoning the trail entirely. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that sound. Thorns tore at my clothes. Branches slapped my face. I slipped more than once, catching myself on rocks and roots, my hands coming away scraped and bleeding. The forest felt hostile now, every shadow a threat, every rustle a warning. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until I could no longer hear anything but my own heartbeat roaring in my ears. Eventually, I stumbled into a shallow ravine where the ground leveled out, and the trees thinned just enough to let light through. I collapsed against a boulder, gasping for breath, listening hard. There were no footsteps. I stayed there a long time, long enough for the shaking to ease and my breathing to slow. I drank water with hands that wouldn't quite steady. Every creak of the forest made me flinch, but nothing followed me. Nothing spoke back. When I finally stood and oriented myself, I realized I'd gone far off course. I didn't recognize the terrain, but I knew enough about the mountains to head downhill, toward where the road should be. I moved slowly now, carefully, afraid to draw attention again. Hours later, though it felt like days, I broke through the tree line near the sound of distant traffic. The sight of asphalt nearly made me cry. I stumbled onto the shoulder of the road, filthy and torn, and flagged down the first car that passed. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, looked me over with concern but didn't ask many questions. People in those mountains know better than to pry. As he drove me back toward my car, I glanced at the forest sliding past the window. It looked peaceful again, just trees and shadow and light. No sign of what I'd heard. Before I got out, the man spoke. "You didn't hike that spur alone, did you?" he asked. I hesitated. "I thought I did." He nodded slowly, eyes on the road. "Those trails, remember, folks," he said. "Sometimes they walk with you a while. Best not to answer back. I never went back to that trail. I hiked plenty still, but never alone, and never off the well-marked paths. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods and the forest grows quiet, I catch myself slowing, listening for a second set of steps, and every time, I pray I only ever hear my own." Story 20. The trail that led me back. I picked that trail because it felt safe. That's the truth of it, and it's the part that still makes my stomach knot when I think about it. It was a loop I'd walked more times than I could count, a comfortable ribbon of dirt and roots cut through hardwoods and pine, just long enough to feel earned without ever feeling risky. I'd done it in all seasons, alone and with friends, in heat and snow. I knew where the ground sloped, where the rocks liked to roll underfoot, where the creek crossed close enough that you could hear it without seeing it. I didn't bring a map because I didn't need one, or so I thought. The morning I went out, the sky was a flat, dull gray that pressed low over the ridgeline. Fog hung in the trees, not thick enough to blind you, just heavy enough to soften edges and make distances feel wrong. Sound traveled strangely in it. My boots sounded too loud on the trail, then suddenly too quiet, like the forest was swallowing the noise as soon as it left me. I remember thinking it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I parked at the small gravel lot just off the Forest Service road. No other cars. That wasn't unusual on a weekday. The trailhead sign stood crooked where frost had heaved it over the years, the wood dark with moisture. I remember checking my watch out of habit, even though I wasn't on a schedule. Late morning. Plenty of daylight. I locked my truck, shouldered my pack, and stepped onto the trail without a second thought. The first hour went the way it always did. The trail climbed gently, switchbacking through tall trees, the ground damp but firm. Fog drifted between trunks like smoke, thinning in places, thickening in others. I passed familiar landmarks without really thinking about them. The split oak struck by lightning years ago, the boulder that looked like a crouching animal from the right angle, the narrow stretch where the trail pinched close to a drop-off. Everything felt right. Familiar. That was part of the problem. As I went higher, the fog grew denser. The forest closed in, trunks looming closer together, their tops lost somewhere above the gray. My sense of distance started to slip. I'd look ahead and think a bend was only a few steps away, then find myself walking far longer than expected before reaching it. Time felt elastic, stretching and snapping back in small, unsettling ways. I chalked it up to the weather. Fog does that, I told myself. It messes with your head. After a couple of hours, I reached the bend where the trail usually started its long descent back toward the parking lot. I'd been looking forward to that part. The way the ground eased downward, the subtle change in air as you dropped elevation, the sense of turning back toward something known. When I rounded the bend, I slowed, confused. The trail climbed, not sharply, just enough that it was unmistakable. The dirt rose ahead of me, winding up between trees instead of dipping down toward the valley. I stopped there, standing in the fog, listening to my own breathing. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd made a wrong turn without realizing it. But there were no intersections, no side trails, just the same narrow path I'd been following all morning. I pulled my phone out and checked it, more out of habit than hope. No signal. The screen felt dim and useless in my hand. I turned in a slow circle, scanning for landmarks, trying to anchor myself. Everything looked right. Too right. The trees, the rocks, the curve of the trail itself, all of it felt familiar, like a memory that didn't quite line up with the present. I told myself I'd misremembered. Trails change over time. Erosion, reroutes, small adjustments made by people who know the land better than I do. I shrugged it off and kept going, boots biting into the damp earth as the trail climbed. The forest grew quieter the higher I went. Not silent, exactly, but muted. No birds, no distant wind. Even the sound of my own footsteps felt dull, like it was being absorbed before it could echo. The fog thickened until the world shrank to a narrow tunnel of gray and brown, 10, maybe 15 feet in any direction. I don't know how long I walked after that. My watch said another 2 hours had passed by the time the trees began to thin. Light brightened ahead of me, diffused and pale, and for a brief moment I felt a rush of relief. I stepped forward, pushed through a final line of saplings, and froze. I was standing at the trailhead parking lot. The gravel crunched under my boots. The crooked sign stood exactly where it should have been. And 10 feet away, parked at the far edge of the lot, was my truck. I stared at it, my mind refusing to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It felt like walking into a room you locked behind you, only to find it wide open. Relief surged first, hot and dizzying. Then confusion followed close behind, heavy and cold. I checked my watch again. Hours had passed. Too many hours. I dropped my pack onto the tailgate and sat there, breathing hard, fog curling around the edges of the lot. My legs trembled, the familiar ache of a long hike settling into my muscles. I told myself I'd looped around faster than I realized, that the fog had tricked me, bent my sense of direction, but that the loop had done what it always did, brought me back. I drank some water, ate a granola bar with hands that shook more than they should have. After a while, the panic ebbed, replaced by stubborn determination. I wasn't lost. I wasn't going to let one strange moment turn into a story I'd laugh about later. I shouldered my pack again and stepped back onto the trail, determined to finish the loop properly this time, to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. The second hike felt different from the start. The fog hadn't lifted, but it seemed heavier somehow, closer to the ground. The forest felt tighter, the trees leaning in just a little more. I paid careful attention to every landmark this time, noting details out loud under my breath like a mantra. Lightning-struck oak, split rock, narrow drop-off. Everything matched my memory exactly. That should have reassured me. It didn't. The same sense of time stretching returned, stronger now. I'd hike for what felt like half an hour, then glance at my watch to see only 10 minutes had passed. Other times, I'd swear I'd only just started climbing a slope, only to find my legs burning as if I'd been at it far longer. The fog seemed to swallow distance entirely. The trail ahead never appeared closer, no matter how long I walked. When I reached the bend again, my chest tightened. The trail climbed. I stood there longer this time, heart pounding, staring at the upward slope like it was a personal betrayal. I knew, absolutely knew, that it wasn't supposed to do that. I turned around, walked a short way back, then returned to the bend again, hoping somehow it would look different the second time. It didn't. A cold thought crept in then, quiet but persistent. What if I wasn't misremembering? What if the trail wasn't changing at all? I pushed that thought away and kept going, telling myself I'd circle back eventually. The forest grew denser, the fog so thick in places it beaded on my eyelashes. Sound vanished entirely now. Even my breathing felt muffled. I tried calling out once, just to hear something break the stillness. My voice sounded wrong, flat and distant, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Hours passed. Or minutes. Or something in between. When the trees thinned again and the pale light opened ahead of me, dread settled deep in my gut. I already knew what I was going to see. The parking lot. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it. The gravel looked undisturbed. The sign leaned at the same tired angle. Nothing had changed. I dropped my pack harder than before, anger flaring through the fear. I checked my watch again. More time gone. My head throbbed with a dull pressure like ache, the kind you get from too much silence. I paced the edge of the lot, trying to orient myself, scanning the tree line for anything out of place. The fog pressed close, cutting off the forest just a few yards in. That was when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. The ground near the lot was soft, damp enough to hold impressions. But as I crouched to look closer, my stomach dropped. The prints circled my truck in a loose ring, unevenly spaced, like someone had been walking back and forth. They weren't boot prints I recognized, not the tread pattern I was wearing. They were deeper at the heel, lighter at the toe, as if whoever made them had been standing still for long stretches, shifting their weight. They didn't lead to the trail. They didn't lead to the road. They just circled my truck, over and over. I straightened slowly, every nerve in my body screaming. The fog seemed thicker now, closer. The trees beyond it nothing more than dark suggestions. I had the overwhelming sense that if I stepped back onto that trail again, something would change. Or something would finally happen. I didn't test that thought. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors with shaking hands. As I pulled out of the lot, gravel crunching too loud in the quiet, I caught sight of the trailhead in my mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the fog, a shape standing where the path disappeared into trees. I didn't slow down to look closer. I drove straight to the ranger station and didn't stop until I was parked under its dull fluorescent lights, the normal hum of the building washing over me like a lifeline. The ranger on duty listened without interrupting as I told him what happened. He didn't look surprised. That was the worst part. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said that section of trail had been rerouted years ago. Not officially marked yet, he added. Too many reports of hikers losing time, of loops that didn't loop, of people coming back exhausted and confused, convinced they'd walked for far longer than they could account for. Fog doesn't help, he said quietly. Some places up there, they don't like being crossed the same way twice. I don't hike alone anymore, and I never take a trail for granted, no matter how familiar it feels. Sometimes, when I think about that parking lot, I wonder how long those footprints had been there before I noticed them, and whether they'd still be circling if I'd tried one more time to finish the loop. Story 3Z. Voices beyond the tree line. I started that hike alone on purpose. That's something I feel like I need to say up front, because people always assume accidents or poor planning when things go wrong in the backcountry. I wasn't careless. I wasn't inexperienced. I'd been hiking those Appalachian trails since I was a teenager, long enough to know the difference between solitude and danger. That week, I wanted the kind of quiet you can only find miles from pavement, where your phone stops pretending it works and the world shrinks down to dirt, breath, and time. It was early October, the shoulder of fall when the leaves haven't fully dropped yet, but the air has started to bite just enough to keep you alert. I parked at a small trailhead just after dawn, signed the log like you're supposed to, and set out with a light pack. No rush. No destination beyond a loop I'd done before, one that dipped deep into national forest land most people avoided because it wasn't scenic enough for photos. Dense hardwoods, narrow switchbacks, long stretches where the trail felt more remembered than maintained. The first few hours were perfect. The forest felt alive in a balanced way, squirrels darting through leaf litter, distant birds calling back and forth, the faint sound of wind moving higher up the ridge. Sunlight filtered through branches in thin bands, warming patches of trail and leaving others cool and damp. I remember thinking how good it felt to be alone without feeling lonely, how rare that balance is. By late morning, I'd reached the deepest point of the loop. The trail narrowed there, hemmed in by thick brush on one side and a steep drop. Off on the other, where the land fell away sharply into a ravine choked with rhododendron and fallen trees. You couldn't see the bottom from the trail, just layers of shadow and tangled green. It was the kind of place you didn't linger, not because it was scary, but because it demanded attention. One bad step and you'd be tumbling a long way down. That's where I heard my name. It was faint at first, almost easy to dismiss, just a sound slipping through the forest, carried on air I hadn't noticed moving. I stopped walking automatically, boots settling into the dirt as my brain tried to decide if what I'd heard was real. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the forest again. Then it came back clearer this time. "Hey, can you help me?" The voice came from off the trail, somewhere downslope to my right. It sounded like a man's voice, strained, breathless, the way someone sounds when they're injured or scared. My first reaction was immediate and physical. My chest tightened. My pulse jumped. Every decent instinct I had told me someone needed help, that this was exactly the situation where you didn't hesitate. But something about it didn't sit right. I couldn't place why at first. The voice didn't echo the way it should have in that ravine. It sounded flat, like it was being pressed through leaves instead of bouncing off rock and trees. And the direction, It was coming from thick brush, far from where anyone should reasonably be unless they'd gone badly off trail. That alone wasn't impossible, but paired with the terrain, it felt wrong. I didn't answer right away. I scanned the area, heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The forest still sounded normal then. Birds called overhead. Leaves rustled faintly. I took a careful step closer to the trail's edge, peering down into the tangle below. "I can't see you," I called back. "Where are you?" There was a pause. Not the kind you expect when someone's catching their breath or shifting position, but a clean, empty pause like the forest itself was waiting. Then the voice spoke again. This time it didn't ask for help. It said my name. Hearing your own name spoken by someone you can't see does something strange to your body. It bypasses logic. My stomach dropped, and for a split second I almost answered automatically, the way you do when someone calls you from another room. But the sound of it stopped me cold. It wasn't quite right. The cadence was off, like the syllables had been learned rather than lived with. The tone was close to human, close enough that if you weren't paying attention, you'd accept it without question. But I was paying attention now, and the more I listened, the more unsettled I felt. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Are you hurt?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, from a slightly different direction, my name again. The forest went quiet around me in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. The birds had stopped. No insects, no wind. The absence of sound was so sudden it felt like pressure in my ears, like stepping underwater. I took a step back from the edge of the trail. My name came again, closer now, from below and to the left. The voice sounded similar but not identical, same general pitch, same strained quality, but the emphasis was different, like someone trying to mimic a word they'd only heard once. I didn't respond. I stood there frozen, eyes darting between patches of brush, trying to pinpoint movement. That's when I realized the voices weren't moving toward the trail the way a lost or injured person would. They were repositioning. Circling. My name echoed again, and this time another voice overlapped it, slightly higher, almost curious. Then another, deeper and slower. Each one was just a little off, like variations on the same recording played through different mouths. My breathing turned shallow. I could hear it loud in my own ears, and I became acutely aware of how exposed I was, alone, miles from help, standing on a narrow strip of dirt between safety and a long fall. Every instinct that had told me to help now screamed something else entirely. "Do not go off the trail." I backed up slowly, careful not to turn my back on the ravine. Dry leaves crunched softly under my boots, and one of the voices immediately changed tone, sharper now, more insistent, repeating my name faster. The others followed, overlapping, filling the quiet forest with that single word. They weren't shouting. They weren't angry. That somehow made it worse. They sounded patient. As I retreated, the voices adjusted, maintaining distance, staying just out of sight. I caught glimpses of movement in the brush, not clear shapes, just shifts in shadow, leaves trembling where there was no wind. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on my trekking pole, not because I planned to use it, but because holding onto something solid felt like the only thing keeping me upright. I reached the point where the trail widened slightly, where it bent away from the ravine and into thicker trees. The moment my boots crossed fully back onto that packed earth, the voices stopped, all at once. The silence that followed was deafening. No echo, no fading away, just gone like a switch had been flipped. I stood there for a long time, afraid to move, afraid that if I acknowledged the quiet it would break again. Slowly, sound returned to the forest, one bird call, then another, leaves stirring faintly above me. The world stitched itself back together like nothing had happened. I finished the hike on autopilot. I didn't look off the trail again. Not once. Every time the path narrowed or dipped, I kept my eyes forward, focused on the next marker, the next bend. I jumped at normal sounds. A snapping branch sent my heart racing. A gust of wind made me flinch. When I finally reached my car hours later, my legs felt weak with relief. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before turning the key, hands resting uselessly in my lap. Part of me wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that isolation and fatigue had played tricks on my mind. But imagination doesn't stop on command. Those voices had. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding dramatic or foolish. It wasn't until weeks later, sitting in a diner in a small mountain town, that the subject came up by accident. An older woman behind the counter overheard me mentioning the trail and shook her head slowly. "Kids around here," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "We teach them young. If you hear someone calling your name in the woods, you don't answer. Don't matter if it sounds like your daddy or your best friend. You stay on the trail and you keep walking." I asked her why. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Because the woods listen," she said. "And sometimes they answer back. I still hike. I still love those mountains. But there are places I won't go anymore, and moments when the forest goes too quiet that make me stop cold. Sometimes, when I'm alone and the air is still, I think I hear my name carried faintly on the wind, just at the edge of understanding. And every time I keep walking eyes forward, pretending I didn't hear a thing." Story 40. The campfire that wasn't there. I planned the hike months in advance, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself you still know how to be alone. Work had thinned me out in ways I didn't notice until everything felt hollow. Conversations sounded rehearsed, noise felt invasive. I wanted quiet that didn't ask questions. The trail I chose cut deep into a stretch of Appalachian backcountry I'd hiked pieces of before, but never overnight and never alone. It was designated, mapped, boring on paper. That felt safer. I told friends where I'd be, left a note in my car, packed more food than I needed. All the responsible things. None of it mattered later. The hike-in was uneventful, which lulled me into a kind of false confidence. The trail wound through old hardwoods, leaves just beginning to yellow, the air carrying that damp, mineral smell that only mountains have. Every so often I'd pass a trail marker or a weathered sign reminding people about bears and fire safety, the usual warnings that feel abstract until you're actually out there. The farther I went, the quieter it got. Not peaceful quiet. The kind that feels like sound has been absorbed, soaked into the ground. Even my footsteps felt intrusive. I reached the designated backcountry site an hour before dusk. It was exactly what the map promised: a small clearing, a stone fire ring, a flat spot for a tent, and nothing else. No water nearby, no view. Just trees closing in on all sides like they'd grown tired of leaving space. I remember thinking how exposed it felt despite being surrounded. Like standing in the middle of a room where all the walls are too far away to touch. I set up camp methodically, letting routine anchor me. Tent first. Food hung in a bear bag. Boots lined neatly by the entrance. I told myself I'd make a small fire once it got darker. Just enough to take the edge off the cold. The sun slipped behind the ridgeline faster than I expected, shadows pooling between the trees, until the clearing felt smaller by the minute. The woods don't ease into night. They shut it off like a switch. That was when I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was my eyes adjusting. A trick of contrast as the last light faded. But once I focused on it, I couldn't unfocus. Deep in the trees, well beyond the edge of the clearing, there was a faint orange light. Low to the ground. Steady. Too warm to be moonlight, too defined to be reflection. It looked exactly like a campfire seen from a distance. Relief hit me so fast it was embarrassing. I hadn't realized how tense I was until that moment. Knowing someone else was out there, even a stranger, made the forest feel less vast, less interested in me specifically. I told myself it had to be another hiker who'd set up off trail, someone bending the rules. It happened all the time. The light wasn't moving, wasn't flickering much, but I chalked that up to distance. I watched it while I cooked dinner. Every few minutes I'd glance back to make sure it was still there. It was. Same size. Same brightness. Perfectly round, like a coal held in a fist. No smoke drifted up through the branches. No sparks jumped. I didn't hear voices or laughter or the pop of burning wood. But the woods play tricks with sound, I knew that. Or thought I did. By the time full dark settled in, the glow felt closer, even though I knew it wasn't. Darkness compresses space like that. I sat on a log at the edge of my clearing and stared at it, waiting for it to do something. Flare, dim, shift as someone moved around it. It never did. Hours seemed to pass marked only by my own breathing and the occasional snap of something moving far away. Not close. Never close. I built my own fire eventually, small and practical. Its light felt weak compared to that other glow, which stayed constant and indifferent, like it wasn't really burning anything at all. At one point, I tried to count how many trees stood between us, tracing lines in the dark. It didn't help. The forest swallowed depth. Around midnight, unease replaced relief. I realized I'd been watching the glow for so long my eyes hurt. The thought crept in slowly, unwelcome but persistent. If that was a real campfire, someone had been sitting there for hours without tending it. No wood added, no shifting shadows, no movement at all. Even the most disciplined hiker has to move eventually. I told myself maybe they'd turned in early, banked the fire just right. But banked fires still breathe. They change. This thing didn't. I lay down in my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, the glow burned against the inside of my eyelids. I kept imagining it wasn't a fire at all, just something that looked like one, because my brain wanted it to be, a familiar shape to make the dark make sense. I listened hard for any sound that might confirm another person. Coughing, footsteps, the scrape of metal. Nothing. Sometime later, I don't know how long I heard movement, not from the direction of the glow, but closer. Slow, careful steps in leaf litter. The sound stopped whenever I held my breath, started again when I exhaled. I lay perfectly still, staring at the mesh ceiling of my tent, heart beating so loud I was sure it carried. I considered calling out, but the idea of breaking the silence felt wrong, like shouting in a church. The steps never entered the clearing. They circled it, just beyond the reach of my firelight, pacing in an uneven rhythm that suggested someone unaccustomed to shoes. When it finally stopped, I realized my jaw hurt from clenching it. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out of shallow, fractured dreams where the glow pressed closer and closer until it filled everything. Sometime before dawn, the forest went utterly still. No insects. No wind. The silence felt deliberate, like a held breath. That's when I made a decision that still feels foolish in retrospect. I decided to approach the glow. I told myself it was better to know. That daylight was coming, and I could handle whatever it was. That it was probably nothing. I unzipped the tent slowly, wincing at the sound, and stood up. My legs felt numb, heavy like they didn't belong to me. The moment I straightened, the glow vanished. Not dimmed, not faded gone. 1 second it was there, steady and patient. The next the woods were swallowed in complete darkness. No afterimage. No lingering warmth. Just absence. It felt like something had noticed me noticing it and chosen to stop pretending. I stood there frozen, my own fire suddenly pathetic, its light shrinking against the black wall of trees. I waited for the glow to reappear. It didn't. I waited for something else instead, a sound, a movement, anything. Nothing came. The forest resumed its normal night noises like nothing had happened, insects starting up again in uneven waves. I went back into the tent and zipped it shut with shaking hands. The inside smelled like nylon and fear. I lay there until morning, eyes open, listening for footsteps that never returned. When dawn finally came, it felt thin and insubstantial, more gray than light. I emerged stiff and exhausted, every muscle sore from tension. The first thing I did was walk toward where I'd seen the glow. I expected to find something, ashes, charred wood, a ring of stones. Anything to prove it had been real. There was nothing, no burn marks, no disturbed ground. The leaves lay undisturbed, damp with dew. I knelt and pressed my palm into the soil, half expecting warmth. It was cold. The air smelled clean, like morning always does, with no hint of smoke. That's when I saw the footprints. They came from deeper in the woods, a faint line of impressions pressed into the soft earth. Bare feet. Long toes. The stride was uneven, sometimes dragging, sometimes too long, like whoever made them wasn't used to walking upright for extended periods. They led straight toward my campsite. They stopped just outside the fire ring. No prints inside, no sign they'd stepped into the clearing. Just that line ending abruptly, toes pointed toward where I'd slept. I compared them to my boots, my shoes. They didn't match anything I had. The size was wrong, too wide. Too shallow, like the person didn't weigh much or knew how to distribute it. I packed up in silence. Every sound felt amplified. I kept expecting to hear breathing behind me, to feel eyes on my back. The woods looked the same as they had the day before, but I no longer trusted that. When I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I didn't look back. The hike out felt longer than it should have. The trail markers seemed farther apart. Familiar bends didn't arrive when expected. At one point, I was certain I heard something moving parallel to me, just out of sight. I didn't stop to listen. I didn't call out. I just kept walking until my legs burned. When I reached my car, relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on the gravel. I checked my phone, no service, but the time was right. The world hadn't slipped. Not completely. I reported what happened when I got back to town, framing it carefully. Strange light. Possible unauthorized camper. Unusual footprints. The ranger I spoke to listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded once. "You're not the first to mention lights," he said. "Or people who don't quite fit." "What does that mean?" I asked. He shrugged. "Means some folks live deeper than maps account for. Best not to go looking for company out there." I didn't ask him to explain. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. I still hike, but never alone and never overnight. Sometimes, when I'm driving past the mountains at dusk, I catch a glimpse of orange deep between the trees, steady and low. I never stop to look. I don't want to know if it's still there, waiting for someone to mistake it for comfort. Story 5. The trail sign that watched me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going that day. That wasn't unusual for me back then. I'd grown up around the edges of Appalachia, close enough to feel the pull of the woods, but far enough away that people like me treated it as something to visit, not something that shaped you. Hiking alone had always felt like a kind of reset. No cell service, no noise, just miles of trees and time to think. I told myself I was careful. I told myself I respected the land. Looking back, I realize how thin that respect really was. The trailhead wasn't marked on any main road sign. I found it by accident, slowing down on a narrow mountain road because I thought I saw an old Forest Service placard half, hidden by vines. The gravel pull-off was barely wide enough for one car. No other vehicles, no trash, no fresh footprints. That should have been my first sign, but instead it felt like a gift. A place no one else bothered with. A quiet trail on a mild fall morning, the kind where the air smells like damp leaves and cold stone. The sign at the trailhead was old wood, gray with age, the lettering so faded it was more suggestion than words. I could just make out an arrow and what might have once been a trail name, but time and weather had eaten most of it away. I remember touching the post, feeling how solid it still was, sunk deep into the ground. Someone had cared enough to put it there properly. That mattered to me then. It made the place feel legitimate, safe. The forest closed in almost immediately. The trail was narrow but clear, packed dirt with leaves pressed into it by years of boots. Tall hardwoods rose up on either side, their tops knitting together overhead. The light filtered down in pale bands, and everything was quiet except for the soft crunch of my steps and the distant tapping of a woodpecker somewhere uphill. It felt old, but not abandoned. Used, but not recently. About 15 minutes in, I saw the first sign. It stood just off the trail, mounted on a short post, the wood darker than the one at the trailhead. This one still had visible lettering, carved deep and filled once with paint that had long since peeled away. I couldn't read what it said without stepping closer, so I did. As I shifted to the side, the sign seemed to tilt slightly. Just a fraction. I stopped, watching it, half amused. Uneven ground, I figured. The post probably wasn't set straight. When I moved again, it happened a second time. A faint creak, like old wood under strain, and the sign rotated just enough that it was squarely facing me again. I laughed under my breath, the sound too loud in the quiet. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the sign. It was heavier than I expected. Solid. I tried to turn it myself, just to see if it was loose. But it resisted, stiff and reluctant, as if it hadn't been meant to move at all. I let go and stepped back. The sign stayed facing me. I told myself it was nothing. Old materials warp, posts twist. The mountains are full of strange little quirks like that. I took a photo of it more as a joke than anything else, and continued on. The trail dipped and curved, following the contour of the slope. The woods grew thicker, the air cooler. I realized at some point that the forest had gone quiet. Not suddenly. Gradually. The woodpecker stopped. No insects buzzed. Even the breeze seemed to have died. I slowed without meaning to, listening. The only sound was my own breathing and the dull thud of my boots. That's when I saw the second sign. It was positioned closer to the trail this time, almost brushing my shoulder as I passed. I stopped short, a prickle running up my spine. This sign was newer than the first. Not new exactly, but better maintained. The wood was less weathered. The lettering clearer. An arrow pointed off to the left, toward a section of forest where the trees grew dense and dark. As I shifted my weight, the sign creaked. Slowly, deliberately, it turned on its post until the arrow pointed directly at me. I didn't touch it this time. I stood there, heart beating harder than it should have been, staring at the arrowhead now aimed squarely at my chest. The motion had been smooth, controlled. Not the wobble of loose wood, not the random shift of warped materials. I stepped to the side, testing it, and the sign followed, rotating just enough to keep its face oriented toward me. The forest felt different then. Not quiet, exactly, tense. Like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air feels thick and charged. I became aware of how alone I was. No voices, no distant traffic, just trees and old wood and the soft creak of something turning to watch me. I backed away until the sign was no longer within arm's reach, then turned and continued down the trail. I didn't run. I told myself not to run. Panic makes you stupid. Panic gets you hurt. I walked, steady and fast, forcing my breath to stay even. The third sign appeared less than 5 minutes later. This one was different, taller. The post rose higher than the others, the signboard mounted at eye level. The wood was dark, almost black, swollen from years of moisture. There was no lettering on it at all. Just a blank, weathered plank. I stopped several feet away. My pulse thudded in my ears. I waited, watching it. Nothing happened. I took a cautious step forward. Still nothing. Another step. The smell hit me then. Wet earth, old leaves, and something else underneath, faint but unmistakable. The smell of something that had been closed up for a long time, like a cellar you shouldn't open. The sign creaked. It turned slowly, the sound stretching out, each fraction of movement deliberate. It didn't stop until it was facing me dead on. The blank wood felt worse than words would have. There was no direction here, no information. Just acknowledgement. I don't remember deciding to leave. I just know that suddenly I was turning around, retracing my steps, the trail feeling narrower than before. My pace picked up. My breath came faster. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, to reach the trailhead and the safety of my car. That's when I saw the fourth sign. It stood directly in the center of the trail. This one was smaller, the wood pale and freshly cut compared to the others. The arrow was clear and sharp, the point clean. It wasn't angled toward any side trail. It pointed straight back the way I'd come. For a long moment, I stood there staring at it. The forest around me felt impossibly still. Even my own breathing sounded muted, like the air itself was dampening sound. I stepped to the side. The sign turned. I stepped back the other way. It followed. I didn't test it again. Something inside me snapped loose then, a deep, animal certainty that I was no longer welcome here. That whatever these signs were meant for, I was standing on the wrong side of them. I turned and ran. The trail blurred beneath my feet. Branches slapped at my arms and face. Roots snagged at my boots. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. The forest seemed to stretch, the distance between familiar landmarks growing longer instead of shorter. My lungs burned. My legs ached. The smell followed me, stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat. At some point, I heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly. More like the soft groan of wood under strain, repeated over and over, as if something was turning again and again, keeping pace just out of sight. I burst out of the trees and into the gravel pool, off so hard I nearly fell. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, sun glinting off the windshield like nothing had happened. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I got inside, slammed it shut, and locked it without thinking. I didn't sit there to calm down. I started the engine and pulled away, gravel spraying under my tires. I didn't stop until I was back on a main road with other cars, and clear signage and cell service strong enough to make my phone buzz nonstop with missed notifications. For days after, I told myself it had been stress, fatigue, my mind filling in gaps where there were none. But the memory didn't fade the way imagined things do. It stayed sharp. The sound of wood creaking slowly. The way the signs moved just enough, never more than necessary. I went looking for the trail online. State park maps, old hiking forums, archived Forest Service documents. Nothing, no record of it anywhere. The road existed, the pull-off existed. But according to every official source I could find, there had never been a trail there. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back, telling myself I just wanted closure. The pull-off was there, just as I remembered. The forest looked ordinary in daylight. No sense of pressure, No unnatural quiet, but the trailhead sign was gone. In its place was a bare patch of ground, the soil darker where a post might once have been. No holes, no broken wood. Just forest reclaiming space like it always does. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind in the trees, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. Eventually I left. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of walking that trail again. In the dreams, I don't run. I keep going forward, past the signs, deeper into the woods where the arrows don't point anywhere anymore. I wake up with the smell of damp earth in my nose and the feeling of being watched, like the forest is still oriented toward me, waiting for me to step just a little farther off the path.